Hey, good morning, everyone. We will go ahead and get started here in just a minute. Good morning, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Iris Caldwell. I work at the Energy Resources Center at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and we facilitate the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group, which provides a forum for information exchange and development of best management practices that promote habitat on working landscapes such as transportation and utility rights of way. And we're excited to help put together this webinar, providing a research update on some really important work exploring the opportunities for monarch butterfly habitat along roadsides. Before we get to that, I have just a few brief announcements and some housekeeping items. We have our next Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group meeting next week, which we are putting on in collaboration with the Electric Power Research Institute and the Edison Electric Institute, and the workshop will be held in Washington, D.C. We do offer web access, so you can log in and participate remotely in the two-day meeting, but registration for webinar access closes tomorrow. So we encourage you to go to this URL link on the slide for more information and to register for webinar access to the meeting. As far as logistics today, everyone will be on mute except for myself and the presenters. If you're having any technical issues, please use the chat box in the GoToWebinar, and we will respond as best we can to any of those issues. If you have any questions for the presenters related to the content of today's webinar, type those into the chat box, and we've specifically saved some time at the end of the webinar for those questions and discussion. But you can submit any questions throughout the presentation. So as you think of them, type them into the chat box. So let's turn to today's topic. As I said, we're really excited to present this research update on monarchs and roadsides. This webinar follows several previous ones that have explored similar issues and topics for monarchs and pollinators on roadside habitat. Monarch Joint Venture and the Federal Highway Administration specifically have had a number of past webinars on this topic, and they're posted to their respective websites. But it's been a year or two since some of those webinars, and so we wanted to provide this research update as a way to explore the growing interest and work that's been done on this topic. And again, we're excited to highlight several of those research studies today. So we have 5 presenters. The first presenter will be Allison Caribou, who is the science coordinator at Monarch Joint Venture. And Monarch Joint Venture is a group of more than 75 partners that are working together to conserve monarch migration. And she serves, in addition to that role, she serves on the U.S. and Trinational Monarch Science Conservation Partnerships. She's in the Rights of Way Working Group for the Mid-America Monarch Conservation Strategy. She works on our Rights of Way Habitat Working Group, leading our Metrics and Targets Task Force, and is also on the Stakeholder Advisory Board for Pollinator Health of the Pollinator Research Center. Second, we'll have Kristen Baum. Dr. Baum is a professor in the Department of Integrative Biology at Oklahoma State University. She's been studying pollinators in the Southern Great Plains for more than 20 years. And her research focuses on the effects of land use and management practices on pollinators, including monarch butterflies, but also native bees and honeybees. After that, we'll have Tyler Grant, who's a postdoctoral research associate at Iowa State University. He received his PhD in wildlife ecology in 2015 from Iowa State University, and previous to his PhD, he worked at the Fish and Wildlife Service. Following Tyler, we'll have Anuj Sharma, who is an associate professor at Iowa State University, and he's currently using AI solutions for improving the quality of life. And then lastly, we have Teresa Blader, who's a master's student at Iowa State University, and she'll be sharing her study on monarch oviposition and oviposition on gravel roadsides, particularly using GIS. So with that, let's turn to our first presenter. And Allison, I'm going to give you the mouse control here. Okay, you can take it away.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for logging in. And I'm going to ask if you can see my cursor. Why don't you chat me back, Iris, if that's true? Because if I'm pointing at things with it, I'd like to know whether anyone can see that or not. So,
yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'll be talking today about our current project that we have here at MJV. It's funded by the National Cooperative Highway Research Program. And first, I'm going to give a little background on monarchs and their conservation needs, just as a good underpinning for this whole webinar today. I do work for the Monarch Joint Venture. As Iris indicated, I'm trying to get, here we go. Okay, so there's a little lag. I wanted to acknowledge my collaborators on this project and the inputs of several departments of transportation. This is a really collaborative project, and I couldn't do it without all of the help from these other great researchers that I work with. So monarchs, like other butterflies, start as tiny eggs. They go through a crazy metamorphosis with 5 stages of caterpillars emerging from a chrysalis about a month later. I want to highlight that these juvenile stages for monarchs all revolve around milkweed plants, and that's the only plant they can use for reproduction. And then as adults, they subsist on drinking nectar from flowers. Monarchs, of course, make a tremendous migration, which is fascinating. So in the fall, all the monarchs that are left in North America make their way to their winter grounds, either on the West Coast in groves of trees along the coast of California, or into the mountains of West Central Mexico. And the next spring, those same individuals make their way to the closest milkweed they can find along the Gulf Coast. In the case of the eastern population, many times that's where the first reproduction takes place in the spring. About a month later, their offspring make their way further north into the mid part of the nation, and then a month later, they make their way into the northern part of their range and up into Canada. And so it is the great-grandchildren who make their way back the next year to the winter grounds. And so it's a pretty remarkable event. And so, as you might imagine, for a species with such a widespread distribution, for just one generation, or just one cycle, weather and climate can be a really big factor for them, sometimes being hit by winter storms like this one on the winter grounds, but also things like hurricanes and droughts. They are susceptible to predators, parasites, and disease at all stages of their life, and of course are very vulnerable to habitat loss. And this is true for them in the breeding areas as well as in the winter areas. And this habitat loss has been exacerbated by the use of pesticides such as glyphosate, has removed a lot of habitat from within agricultural regions in their breeding range. So monarchs have declined, as we know, over time, and this graph depicts the way that we measure their population levels is the number of hectares that is occupied in the forest in Mexico. This is for the eastern population. Of course, we see a very similar graph for the western population that was published this year. And I just wanted to highlight that across 3 nations, we've adopted a goal of trying to reinstate the population to a 6-hectare size of occupation of forests in Mexico. And in order to do that, we believe that we would need to add back to the landscape 1.3 billion more milkweed plants. And this has led, this conservation effort and dedication has led to the idea that we really all need to pitch in to create this breeding habitat. It's the all hands on deck idea, and every land use sector can contribute, including rights of ways. So rights of ways as habitat for monarchs is really a great opportunity because of the extensive network that they represent. These areas are managed for non-woody vegetation. Anyhow, we can see that there are some active and very successful pollinator programs in rights of way, and we know that monarchs can breed successfully. So this is an area of great promise. And so our project is developing tools for transportation managers to provide monarch habitat. And we are interested in supporting managers who already have programs, and also providing tools that make it easier for other transportation departments to initiate or become more active in this area. So we have a GIS priority model that will help to predict where a high quality habitat can be established. We have a rapid field assessment. This is a protocol that managers can use to quickly assess the condition of their habitats that they have currently along their roadsides. There is a calculator component for this to derive scores for different sites. And then, of course, best management practices are important in both new and existing vegetation management. And we wish to bring BMP information to managers in a more accessible format. So I'm going to go through each of these areas in detail. And but there's one thing that we did that sort of underpins the whole project. And that is that we worked, we created a survey that we did administered online. And this gave us some information from departments of transportation about their programs and about their capacities and their interests and needs. And so this sort of like gives us a backdrop of understanding who we're working with and what we can do best to meet their needs. And if you're interested in more information from the survey, please ask for it later from me. I can only just touch on it here, but we learned that DOTs do need help with habitat planning, with habitat management. They a lot of times know what they want to do, but they don't have the time to get out and do assessments, and they don't have the money to put into better seed mixes. And also we heard that they have some outreach needs to their publics about what pollinator managed roadsides look like, so that they may be with deferred mowing and integrated vegetation management, they may look different than people have been previously expecting them to look. And so we also asked questions about their capacity to put field teams into the field, and how long could those personnel spend looking at sites, and what would their capacity be for identifying noxious weeds and milkweed and other features of monarch habitat. So our GIS priority habitat model is something that is really targeting revegetation areas, new construction. Maybe a program would like to create a demonstration area for pollinators. So maybe they have some funds that are ready to go for that, and they want to know where to invest this extra effort and funding into pollinator habitat. And so this mapping tool will highlight places with the best habitat potential. These are places where we believe the habitat is most likely to be the most beneficial and persist in the best condition. And so in this map figure here on the right, for instance, the areas that are highly suitable are shown in blue, and the roads that would be less likely to be a good place to invest in pollinator habitat would be low. And we're ranking higher the wider right-of-ways just because there's more bang for your buck in terms of creating a wider, larger habitat patch that is farther removed from the road. And we would be up-ranking sites that are near natural areas and in natural landscapes, and therefore those areas would be less likely to receive chemical inputs and invasion by weeds, which is always a factor. And then this would also be downranking areas with high traffic volume. And that is a threat to monarch habitat, both for direct collision reasons and also for the inputs of chemicals, including salt in places where people salt roads, and also heavy metals that are just a byproduct of vehicle use. So now I'm going to turn to another area, the rapid field assessment and the habitat calculator. These two kind of work together, so I'm going to just present from one to the next. And these are, again, tools for evaluating existing habitat. So what we learned was that vegetation crews would have very little time to look at habitat, but if they did, what could they do in a very quick fashion that would be not too involved, not too complicated, but would give them the information that they need. And so we came up with a rapid assessment. We believe it will take about 10 minutes. Basically, whoever would like to run the evaluation will walk up 150 feet of roadway and then zigzag back throughout the width of the right-of-way. And along the way, they would be making note of any milkweed plants that they encounter. So we will have some, picture sheets that show what the milkweed look like in your area. And they would also be noting the number of blooming nectar plants that are available. Now, if there isn't a familiarity with all the plant species names, that's okay. This would be looking for just a checklist of how many different types of blooming plants are present. And then in addition, they would be looking for weeds. And these are just the noxious weeds that they are required to manage already. And so they will already be knowledgeable about them. And in this case, we're looking at weeds as basically just a threat to the quality of the habitat on the site. If they need to be directly treated, then it is a little bit hard to also be enhancing it for a habitat at the same time. So the weeds kind of need to be taken care of first. In addition, if they're not being treated, then they can also increase in cover. Then also we would be learning about the width of the habitat and also noting how much of that is mowed and noting the adjacent land use. We had an opportunity last year to compare this to a more rigorous protocol, which is the integrated Monarch monitoring program, 100 subplots that are a meter in size, a little bit more quantitative, and we found that this performed favorably in terms of milkweed density and also detecting the same plant species for nectar plants. So we feel like it's pretty good. And also I just wanted to share, this is kind of an aside, but in the places that we looked, and this was in Minnesota, we did find that monarchs' eggs or larvae were present in 35% of the sites that we surveyed that had milkweed. So we plan to create a habitat calculator that is a mobile-friendly website or an app eventually, once we get that sorted out. And this will basically take that rapid field assessment data right into the phone or tablet and create a habitat score. And this score would highlight if a site was really exemplary or if it had some deficiencies, what those would be. And that would then in turn link you to best management practices. And I would like to note that I think this calculator could be used also in other rights of ways. And so if anyone is interested in trying this out in another application, I'd be happy to talk with them about that. So next I'll shift gears to best management practices. And with this, we're really developing ways to communicate In many cases, I think the best management practices they're already taking shape, and it's more a question of creating resources that make sure they're regionally appropriate. Like over here, we've got sort of like this, there's a mowing window map. It's like moving windows, of course, they're going to be different depending on when the monarchs arrive in your area. So keeping in mind that regionality. So, we're thinking of a website that's mobile friendly where, you can choose what region you're in, or it knows what region you're in because you've just entered, say, your habitat calculator information. And then, also best management practices need to be context dependent. And so that comes in with that site profiling. So what are the issues? I have great milkweed, but no nectar plants, or we have actually a really nice set of plants, but we have a really high mowing frequency, or we have really good plants, but we also have a really aggressive, invasive weed situation. And so if we can prioritize that, then maybe next year we could see improved habitat conditions for monarchs. So things like that. And the other thing that we're looking for it's not exactly best management practices, but it's a set of communication tools that we wish to develop also in tandem with the BMPs on our website. So, creating a place for success stories. There are so many great programs in existence, many of which are very geographically specific. So, sometimes it's just one county, really. That's like, funds are so limited, but we can all learn from those. And so helping spread the word, and then create information summaries, sort of like what we're doing today, where we're bringing, research into a more accessible place for managers. I mean, they don't have time to go out and seek out all this information. And so we have in mind that there could be, we could also be creating messaging that DOTs could use to post through social media, or even press releases and things like that. This information sharing, we've heard it'd be really nice too. So those are some things that we're developing. Our next steps for our project. So we're in the middle of a 2-year project. And so we're going to be working on the website. We're also going to be doing field work this year to test the GIS model, parameterize the habitat calculator. And we will, with a couple field crew people, be also assessing monarch use. And that will just give sort of, some baseline information about how monarchs are using different types of roadsides. And we do hope to engage as many DOTs as we can in looking at their habitat priority map and letting us know if it looks helpful or not, or if it needs to be tweaked in any way. And then secondly, trying out the rapid assessment and habitat calculator in their region. If we could get this demonstrated or tested, if you will, throughout all the regions in the US, it will be so much stronger. And so I am still looking to build partnerships in that area. And then finally, I just want to say, even though I've said DOT throughout the presentation, I really think that I'd be so happy to work with other rights-of-way managers as well. So if anyone else is interested, please contact me later. Here's my email address. It does not contain the last letter of my last name. So when you copy that down, that was not a typo. And apparently I've gone really fast, and I'm done. Okay, no, I didn't go fast. I just didn't see my messaging.
No worries. Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Allison. Reminder to everyone, too, as you have questions, please go ahead and pop them into the chat box, and we will work on, we'll have time for questions hopefully at the end. So next up, we'll transition to Dr. Kristen Baum, again from Oklahoma State University, and she'll talk about her work looking at distribution and abundance of milkweed on roadsides in the Southern Plains.
Well, good morning, everybody. So I'm going to talk about an emphasis on the South Central U.S. And so an overview of my talk. I'm waiting to see if the slide advances.
Okay. You do have control, and maybe you could click on the presentation or use your keyboard arrows. There you go.
Okay, so an outline of my talk, I was going to start by providing the context for thinking about the South Central U.S. And the common milkweed species in the region, and then set the stage for discussing some of our research related to monarchs and roadsides. So thinking about our statewide milkweed surveys in Oklahoma, our milkweed and nectar plant responses to different mowing regimes research, and then also just some very preliminary data from this past year on monarch use and survival in contour mode areas. So, so some of our roadsides that had some remaining habitat this fall. And then if there's time, I'll end with a few thoughts about remaining questions. So there's been a documented decline in milkweed availability in the upper Midwest, but we know less about milkweed availability in the South Central US. So we don't really have kind of our starting point in knowing what distribution and abundance looked like, years ago. So trying to figure out what our starting point is a little bit challenging. And it looks like my box is a little bit shifted off there. And so thinking about the South Central US, for us, our most important milkweed species is Asclepias viridis, our green antelope horn milkweed. And based on my research in rangelands, it's also the most visited plant in May and June by native bees. And so it's not only an important host plant for monarchs, but it's also an important nectar source for pollinators in general. And we could say that for most milkweed species. And so you'll notice in the map there that this species occurs throughout most of Oklahoma, with the exception of the Panhandle, as well as much of Kansas and Texas and farther east. And another important milkweed species in the southern region is Asclepias asperula, or spider milkweed. It occurs in central and western Oklahoma, so you kind of shift from Asclepias viridis to Asclepias asperula, and then also in parts of Texas and Kansas and farther west. And I should mention that common names for milkweed species are a little bit of a problem because there's multiple names used for some species, and especially in the southern region, they kind of overlap. So some people also call this one antelope horns milkweed. So this map shows the results of our statewide roadside survey for milkweeds. And so we looked at the distribution and density of milkweeds throughout Oklahoma, excluding the Panhandle. So to do this, we counted the number of milkweed plants on 5-meter by 50-meter belt transects to get our estimate of density. And then we selected different roads and then stopped every 10 miles to collect the milkweed density data. So you can see the little open circles on the map represent areas where we stopped and there wasn't any milkweed on that 5-meter by 50-meter transect. And then the green dots represent areas where there was milkweed present, and then the size of the dots corresponds to the density. So the larger dots represent areas with more milkweed. And so we did this survey in May and June of 2016. So we had 284 transects that were sampled, and 40% of those contained milkweed. Of those with milkweed, 89% contained Asclepias viridis, which again is our most common species in Oklahoma. And then I provided our density estimates there. So on average for those sites with milkweed, we had about 163 plants per acre. And so we also looked at milkweed densities on adjacent land to get an idea of how that compared to the roadsides. And so we used distance sampling for this, and distance sampling takes into account detectability. And it also means that we were able to collect our data from the fence line, so we didn't need to get access to private land. And so we use this for our two most common milkweed species that are blooming in May and June when the surveys were done. And as you saw in the earlier pictures, they both have those light green flowers that make them pretty easy to see from the distance. So you see for our adjacent land uses there, 26% of the adjacent land was in crops, about half in grasslands. And then we had 27.5% where there are the little X's that you see on the map, and those represent areas where there are trees along the fence line. And so we weren't able to get an estimate. So we don't know if there was milkweed on that adjacent land or not. So if you exclude those sites where we couldn't get an estimate of adjacent land, about a third of the remaining sites had milkweed. And then if we look at grasslands in particular, there was an average of 33 plants per acre for those sites. So if we put both of those maps kind of beside each other, you can see, at least for our surveys, that we had more milkweed on roadsides than we did on the adjacent land. So an opportunity for monarchs there. And so now I wanted to shift gears and talk about our milkweed and nectar plant response data in response to mowing regimes. And so this is a collaborative project with Oklahoma Department of Transportation, and we have 25 mowing plots near Stillwater, Oklahoma, and we have 5 different treatments. So we have 5 plots with each treatment. But because there's so much variability on the roadsides, for today, for my purposes, I'm going to combine some of those treatments. I'm thinking about the growing season. So our traditional treatment was mowed 3 to 4 times per year and was originally meant to represent the traditional mowing regime that was used by ODOT, but they've shifted since then and delayed mowing in the spring. So it represents, I guess, what's been done in the past. And then we have the mid-July treatment where a mow was conducted during July, and then a non-mowing treatment that represents areas that were not mowed during the growing season. So that's kind of our control for those sites. So essentially, if we combine those, we end up with three treatments. This shows our starting point for across all the plots in terms of milkweed availability. So we did make sure to select sites that had milkweed so we could study the milkweed. But the point would be that our starting point for each site is going to be a little bit different. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But you can also see we had 2 other milkweed species that showed up in very low densities. And in case you're interested, the one on the left there is the slim leaf milkweed, Asclepias stenophila, and the other one is Asclepias viridiflora, which is green comet milkweed. And so both probably on average showed up, 1 plant every other site. So pretty low densities, but certainly different milkweed species out there in the plots. And so we used as our starting point, the milkweed density that we observed in early July. So early July is when we identified as being that time period when we have the most milkweed out there on the roadsides as well as other areas. So most of the milkweed is up and you don't have senescence or plants dying back yet. And so I plotted data for July and September. And so this is the percent of remaining milkweed based on those July surveys. So based on those early June surveys. So I used June as the starting point. And so you can see, and these data are from 2017, there would be less milkweed in those traditionally mowed plots as one would expect. And then more, and the July data are from mid-July mowing. And so more milkweed present in those mid-July treatments and non-mowed plots later in the year. In particular, if we think about those fall breeding monarchs, we had milkweed present for those. And then I also plotted on this graph the 2017 data that you saw on the previous slide, but then I also put data from 2016 as well. And so you'll notice there's some differences there. And so there is a lot of variability among years, some related to rainfall and other factors. And so getting an idea of what's going on across years will be important as well. And so next, I wanted to talk about some of our nectar plant data. And so for this, we used quadrats, where we measured the percent forb cover, so the number of potential flowering plants that would be present, and also the number of blooming forb species. So for percent cover, we use these small quadrats that were a 1/2 meter by a 1/2 meter. And then for the blooming forb data, we used a larger quadrat of a 1/2 meter by 2 meters. And so looking at the data, the top graphs there are for percent forb cover. And so you can see in general that we've got more forbs present earlier in the year versus later in the year. So those, more cover of those early blooming forbs compared to those later growing ones. And then for the number of blooming forb species, the patterns are a little bit harder to interpret. So just looking at the number of different species that were present in each of those treatments. And we also have data on relative abundance, and that's going to be more informative. We haven't summarized that yet, but thinking about finding that balance between cover, the number of different species, and then what that means for monarchs, getting an idea of the abundance of the blooming wildflowers will be important in kind of our next step for looking at that. And so next, I wanted to talk about monarch use and survival in contour mowed areas. And so these were areas near our plots that I just talked about. So near our mowing regime plots that were contour mowed this past fall. So that would be where the safety zone was mowed. And then areas farther from the road were left depending on what that roadside looked like. So in some cases, those roadsides would be mowed all the way to the fence line. And then other cases you can see in the picture there where there's trees and a little bit of topography, larger areas were left. So not the best of descriptions of contour mowing, but hopefully you get the idea. And so we had 8 different sites, and we pretty much just stopped at our mowing plots and then tried to identify some nearby areas that would work. And so most of these were pretty small, just a little over an acre, a little over 1/2 acre in size. And so combined, we didn't even have 5 acres of habitat, but we went out and searched each of these for monarch eggs and larvae. And so this shows the sum of data across all 8 of those sites. And so if you look at the graph, the first 4 sampling periods, we had about 134 plants that we searched for monarch eggs and larvae. And then as the plants start to die back, we had fewer here on September 20th, only about 88 plants left, and then only 48 on September 28th. And so you see we had quite a few eggs in those plots. So I think we had just over 220 eggs, and that there was a lot of egg laying activity in late August. And so this would represent the 5th generation of monarchs and their activity. And so if we take out the eggs so we can get a closer look at those instars, you can see that I was going to look, I think I summed up the numbers. So I think we had 17 firsts, 13 seconds, 23rds, 13 fourths, and 25th instars across all of those sites. And so what I wanted to do was try to get an idea of survival. And you probably noticed our dates weren't evenly spaced. And so I tried to take a conservative approach. And so I took out our 2 dates that were kind of close in proximity to other dates, and then looked at the remaining data. And so if I did that, we started with 151 eggs, and then all of the remaining visits were 10 to 12 days later. And so we ended up with 14 5th instars. And so that would be a survival rate of just over 9%. So that is in line with previous research that summarized the data from the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, so across the monarchs breeding range. So, a decent amount of activity and survival on those sites. This is another site where you don't actually see any milkweed, but there's a good bit out there. And I think this site's less than an acre, and it's in town. But I think I pulled about 30 late instars off of that area as well. But we do have lots of interesting questions remaining. I think getting more data on survival across a variety of land uses, including roadsides, would be useful. Invasive species are a big issue, and so thinking about trying to have long-term habitat for monarchs. And in Oklahoma, we're thinking about how do these modified mowing regimes affect invasive species, and what needs to be done to address those issues, in particular with Johnson grass for us here. And then there's lots of other interesting questions related to kind of the details of mowing, such as timing and mowing height, and then lots of other factors. And so that I would like to end with thanking Alex Webb, who was a master's student that collected a lot of that roadside data across Oklahoma. Lydia Calhoun and Clayton Hurst and Michael Caballero helped a lot with that as well. Dennis Martin is my collaborator who works closely with ODOT as well. And then we had some funding for our statewide surveys. And with that, I will pass it off to the next presenter.
Great, thank you, Kristen. Again, as you have questions for Kristen, please chat them to us and we'll track them. Next, we're going to move on to Dr. Tyler Grant at Iowa State University, and he's going to speak about his spatially explicit agent-based model.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. And yeah, I'll be talking about something a little more abstract. But boy, it's sure interesting to hear what the other researchers, hear updates on other researchers' work as well. I'm working on a landscape scale, spatially explicit, agent-based model of monarch movement and egg laying. So as we all know, the monarch is declining, and we're working on ways to reverse that decline. A lot of the monarch breeding occurs in the Corn Belt of the Midwest, as many of you know, and there are questions about how they move around and use the habitat on a landscape scale. There are large agricultural fields out there that they can kind of get lost in, and there's not a lot of milkweed. There's a lot of linear habitat like the roadside right-of-ways and some railroad right-of-ways. And then there's block habitat such as pastures and grasslands and so forth, and small patches such as gardens and monarch way stations. So a big question is linking these pieces of habitat on the landscape. How are monarchs moving around the landscape and finding these habitats? And can we put habitat, once we understand how they're using the landscape, can we put habitat in places that they're more likely to find or use? So we're working in Story County, Iowa, is where we've done all the modeling so far. And this is pretty typical of a lot of places in the Midwest. And so you can see the grid-like pattern of the roadsides and the agricultural fields in between. And you've got some grass and pastures along the streams, but there's not a lot of habitat variability. So the technology isn't available yet to track monarchs across large scales, across landscape scales like that. So that's why we decided, that's why we created a model to get some insight on what's happening. So the model simulates individual female monarch butterflies as they move around the landscape and lay eggs. And we had to add some new innovations, perceptual range. So in the model, monarchs respond to the habitat within their perceptual range. And they also have a kind of spatial memory where they are less likely to return to a place they've already been. So this is published a month or two ago, kind of the initial description and initial work on this model in ecological modeling. I'd be happy to send you a PDF if you email me. There we go. So just to give you kind of a visual idea of what's happening in the model, on the left here we have 3 simulated Monarch movement paths. So this yellow is Monarch movement paths. This landscape they're on, this is about 4 square miles. So you got agricultural fields out here. The roadsides are modeled as 50 by 50 meter chunks. So because of the heterogeneity in milkweed density in the roadsides. And so you can see in the model, they spend a lot of time flying along roadsides, but they do spend some time wandering around in the middle of these fields, which is mostly a waste of time for them because they don't get to lay eggs out there. And as they're moving around in the model, as you see here, they're also laying eggs. So this figure on the right shows, after you run the model, the different egg densities that come out of the model. So you can see in the roadsides, depending on the milkweed density, you have much lower or higher egg density. You have really low milkweed density in the agricultural fields, because there is still a little bit of milkweed out there, and they'll occasionally lay an egg out there. And then you kind of have medium density in grasslands and pastures and CRP and places like that. So that's what you get out of the model. I'll talk briefly about how it works. It's programmed in the Java programming language in a platform called Repass Symphony. You probably don't need to worry about that. But what happens in the model is the Monarch agent, or the simulated Monarch, moves 50 meters at a time, or a set distance, say 30 meters, and they move 30 meters, then they decide on a direction to go, and they move 30 meters, decide on a direction to go, and so on. And when they're deciding on the direction to go, they look at the habitat around them and make decisions on where to go. So if this is a Monarch here, and he has a 100-meter perceptual range, then she's going to make decisions between this pasture over here, these roadsides, or the cornfield she's in which direction to go. And it's probabilistic, so she has a higher probability of going toward places that have more milkweed, but it's not 100% probability. And that randomness, that probability, is important in modeling real behavior. And so it's the cumulative, so yeah, once she makes a decision, if she moves here, then of course this perceptual range circle will follow to her new place. She'll be closer to this pasture. She'll be more likely to go there now because she can smell the milkweed more. She's closer to it. So the sum total, the cumulative result of all these individual little probabilistic decisions are what results in this natural looking behavior that you saw on the previous screen. So that's basically how it works. There's a few details, like the probability is scaled by the area of of each polygon that they can perceive, but I don't need to get too far into that kind of detail. The main point is that it moves 30 meters at a time, or a step length. It can be 20 or 30 or 40 or 50. Moves one step length at a time, makes a decision every time after evaluating the habitat, and does that over and over. And that's how it works. So we have the model working now. It takes a lot of computational power. We run it on, typically have to run it on depending on the size of the area we're using, we might have to use some advanced computing facilities, they call them now. It doesn't run very well on a laptop, but we're working on some applications for this model now. So here's an example of an application we're working on. So one of the concerns that the NRCS has and that some other people have is, are roadsides a sink? What's the, is it smart to plant milkweed in roadsides, or are we creating kind of an ecological trap or an ecological sink? And so the NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which I assume most of you are familiar with, they have a policy currently in place that they don't want habitat to go in within 125 feet of an agricultural field. Well, in the Corn Belt and in places like Iowa, that excludes, something like 80% of your potential roadsides that you could use to plant habitat. So they need some justification for their decisions, and everyone else, all these other discussions on roadside habitat also need some perspective on a more of a risk assessment type perspective, or a cost benefit, net benefit type of analysis. So that's the type of analysis we're working on. So in this map here, we've run the model in this area. This is our prototype area, and the soybean fields are here in this brownish color, and we placed a buffer, 125-foot buffer on the north side of all these soybean fields. And so we're assuming that the wind is blowing north, which we've looked at the weather data, and that's the prevailing wind direction for when they spray these fields. And now that we've added that in here to the model, we can get a landscape scale look at what's happening. So we run the model on this landscape. We find how many eggs are laid within these buffer zones, these blue buffer zones, and then we can apply different survival rates based on whether they're in that drift zone or whether they're in a natural, whether they've got a natural survival rate in another area. And these survival rates for the different pesticides are coming from another PhD student in my lab. She's doing a lot of work. Excuse me. Her name's Narinjana Krishnan. She's doing a lot of work on the survival rates and survival curves for different instars and different types of pesticides. So we can take that data. We can use an ag drift. Narinjana took this ag drift model to estimate the concentration of the pesticide in these buffer zones, and then we can, with a little bit of math and so on and so forth, we can apply those survival rates to the eggs to estimate how many adults are produced from these areas when they're sprayed or when they're not sprayed. And we also ran some other scenarios where the habitat is augmented with much more milkweed than is currently out there. So, for example, here's current habitat on the left, and we can run, a scenario on the right where you can see that milkweed density, this prob eggs, this is basically milkweed density. So in this scenario on the right, milkweed density has been increased to just about the maximum in all the roadsides and also in some of these grasslands, and it's higher in the little town here and it's higher in some other areas. So we can simulate all these different scenarios and we get a graph like this, a figure like this, where we have a number of monarchs produced on the left over 10 years from this area because they don't spray every year. They don't necessarily spray every year. And so these numbers are relative, right? Because monarchs, you know, even naturally they vary a lot year to year. So you don't want to put too much weight on the absolute number, but we want to look at the relative numbers here. So with current habitat, our simulation produces 28,516 monarchs. If you apply beta cyfluorethrin, I'm not pronouncing that 100% correctly. I'm not a pesticide guy yet. If you apply BCF, the first instar, 5 out of 10 years, then you lose 7% of your monarchs. So that's not insignificant, but it's not the end of the world either. TMX is much less potent, or at least much less dangerous to monarchs. So you lose 4%. Now, if you increase the habitat, on the right side here, we have augmented habitat. You can see in the best case scenario, we've increased the number of monarchs by 24%. And if we apply BCF 5 out of 10 years, we lose some of that, but we don't lose all of it. In the worst case scenario, if you apply BCF 10 out of 10 years, which rarely happens, you're still getting a net benefit of putting all that milkweed out there. And these are just some other scenarios you can see for TMX that it's not nearly as bad. But in all these scenarios, in the worst case, you still have a net benefit of placing milkweed out there. So these are preliminary results. We don't want to, we're still working on expanding this analysis to a full, you know, be fully rigorous in every way. But this gives you a sense of not only what we can do with the model, but also some of our preliminary results. So we'll look forward to, we're looking forward to finishing up this work, hopefully, you know, sometime this year, or hopefully well before the year is over. So with that, I think the take-home points, I hope everyone can remember, is that this model can help us understand monarch movement at a scale that we can't really measure directly right now, and that's why we need a model. It can help us run a lot of cost-benefit analysis of different management scenarios and estimate the net benefit of milkweed plantings. So with that, thanks to, I work with the Iowa Monarch Conservation Consortium and the Iowa State Monarch Working Group, and USDA is funded, and Dr. Grundell at USGS. And with that, I think I'm out of time, so I'll take any questions, or I'll turn it over to Iris.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Tyler. And of course, any questions on Tyler's model or the work he presented, please chat them, and we can address those at the end. So next, we're going to move to Dr. Anu Sharma, who's also at Iowa State University, and he's doing some interesting work with AI and vehicle-mounted cameras to look at milkweed.
Good morning, everyone. I'm associate professor at Iowa State University and working on milkweed detection. One of the biggest issues we see is how do we know what is out there? And Allison mentioned the tool which they are developing, where a person has to walk out in the field and do some data collection. What we were trying to do is, can we use some of the existing means of data collection and use those means to automate some of these issues? So our idea was essentially, if we can, let me see if I can go to the next slide here. Okay, So our idea was to, if we can use some vehicle mounted cameras, and a lot of DOTs go out for estimating their pavement condition almost once in 2 to 3 years, and can we mount an additional camera which is also looking at the side of the road, and then we can use some kind of a vision algorithm to estimate what is the milkweed density in your area. So the video over here shows, as you're driving by, some of these images are recorded, and you can see in the video that as we go through, if there's a milkweed present, it will detect that milkweed. So for developing such algorithm, what we needed was a lot of annotated files. So we did a lot of data collection in terms of mounting this camera on our vehicle and driving miles and miles of road in Iowa, and also getting milkweed images from other sources as well. And then human has to go out and annotate these images. So some of the annotations which we are showing here is basically a bunch of students marking when they see a milkweed at different stages. It can be a bloom, or it can be towards the end when they are kind of very towards the later stages when they are brown and kind of dying out. And if we have enough images, what we can do is we can train our camera video based system to identify these things automatically. So we reduce around 3,000 images from different areas, and we use something called aggregated channel features. We have been trying a couple of different algorithms. One of the good things about ACF, and a lot of people talk about deep learning models, and we are also trying some of those deep learning models. But one of the good things about these ACFs is they can even run on your mobile phone, or they don't require a dedicated GPU. And that was one of the things which we are designing for, is to see if a person is not having such a heavy computational power, can our image processing algorithm still work? So aggregated channel features was one of the things which we tried for that reason. These are some of the detections which are on the captured images. So essentially, when you see a box drawn around something and a number on top of it, that is we picking up automatically a milkweed, and with a certain probability. And what these are some other examples for our camera which we were driving on the road. One of the things which we are interested in is, even if we miss one or two of these milkweed stems, what we are looking for is an overall density. And obviously the camera angle at which you are collecting the data, that significantly changes what you can see. And if the camera cannot see a milkweed, you obviously cannot count it using image processing. So it is important to have it properly mounted. So in our case, this is basically detection accuracy. What the graph is kind of showing is that if you are willing to live with around 20% false positive rates, you are going to get around 70% true positive rate. So this is a trade-off between whether you want to capture every single plant which is out there and get some miscounts or some false calls, or whether you want to be very restrictive in terms of false calls and only use a really heavy when you're really sure that there was a milkweed present. Then we went ahead and we were not happy with our accuracies. We went ahead and did some more data collection and annotation. So then we were able to get around 0.89 in under our AUC curve. What you can see here is that if I'm willing to accept 30% false rate, we can get around 90% true positive. That means we can capture easily if there's a milkweed out there. And these are some other images. So you can see even the good thing about milkweed plant is it has very unique features. I don't think there might be some other plants which might not be well suited for image-based detection, but milkweed with its broad leaves, it is can be easily seen by human eye. So any plant which an expert can easily see while sitting in a car, we can train an algorithm to do that detection. So these are just some of the other images which we are talking about, where we are seeing, if you see some of these images, even a human cannot make sure on the right hand corner image whether it's a milkweed or some kind of a pattern which looks very similar to milkweed. But necessarily, as I said, the goal is not to be 100% accurate, but get an overall idea about what that milkweed density is. So the next thing we wanted to see is if we can do that data collection around Iowa and compare it against some of the data collection going on where humans have went out there and actually counted each of the a single stem. In this case, this is the milkweed detection, which was done by a human by the camera on the left hand side, and on the right hand side you see milkweed detection done by a person. Obviously, if you are doing it on the side of the road manually and the camera cannot see it, you will get higher rates. But what we are looking for is if we can get some density curves like this, which might be automated and save a lot of time. So we still have to do a lot of work in getting out there, mounting the camera at the right places, and getting an idea what the density looks like. But we think that this solution can reduce the number of man hours required to actually estimate whether there are milkweeds out there or not. Another thing would be that even if humans are going out there doing this data collection, instead of them counting each of these, they can just record the video as they are walking, and then the processing can be done later on. So either it can be a vehicle mounted camera or it can be a human walking through, but this image processing algorithms would significantly reduce the man hours required, as well as help us do more and more road miles, cover more and more road miles for detection purposes. This is the end of my slides. My name is Anuj Sharma. If anyone wants to talk more about this or use some of our techniques in their research, please feel free to contact me. My email address is anuj.s@isa.edu, and I'll be happy to respond to your questions at the end of the slides. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Anuj. And so then last but not least, we have Teresa Blatter, also from Iowa State, and she will be talking again about the work that she's done looking at spatial distribution of milkweeds and stem densities, particularly on gravel roadsides, also in Iowa.
Hi, thank you so much for sticking around, everybody. I am the last speaker, so thanks for hanging in there for those of you who are still with us. I'm going to kind of tell you more about some GIS work that I've done sampling milkweed on gravel roadsides in Iowa. The milkweed that Anuj was just talking about was actually some of the data that I had collected. See if we can advance here. Okay. So for my master's research project, I study oviposition, so egg laying, and how that changes in different patch sizes. So in order to do that, I had wanted to look at milkweed on gravel roadsides. Gravel roadsides are a major source of habitat in Iowa. If you look at a map of Iowa, you see that they are gravel roadsides pretty much make up 80% of all roadsides that are actually in Iowa. So to do this, I randomly selected 4 different roadsides. I wanted to do a lot more where I would sample all of the milkweed on roadsides, but my eyes were way too big for my stomach, and we only ended up doing 4. But they were randomly selected outside of the Ames, Iowa area. And generally speaking, they're about 3 acres per roadside. So this is the stem distribution, some maps. So all the yellow dots are milkweed stems. So we surveyed each of these, and we saw that for each week we had a variety of stems, but on average we had 3,554 stems per road. Now on a different metric, that's 576 stems per acre, or 0.14 stems per meter square. So what's interesting is that this is a graph that I'm going to explain a little bit by Thogmartin et al. 2016, where they looked at previous data that has been collected on roadsides and estimated the milkweed stems per acre for different types of habitat. So right here in this little red box is the milkweed stems per acre for different types of roadsides. And so they estimated that there would be 57.17 stems per acre. You can see that's a lot lower than the 576 stems per acre that we've seen. And then they also had two panels that they tried to estimate, as we're establishing habitat, what can we expect to, what is a goal that we can shoot for roadsides? And they estimated between these two panels 100 to 200 stems per acre, which again is a lot lower than the 576 stems per acre that we found that we monitored. Another way that we think about milkweed density is stem density within milkweed patches. So this is a graph that shows for each roadside which proportion of the stems were either 1 stem per meter square, 2 stems per meter square, 3 stems per meter square. So for each of these 4 roads, we see that about 95% of the stems are within a 1 to 5 stems per meter density. So I think this is really informative. So as we're establishing habitat, as we're thinking about whether it's seeds or plugs that we're establishing, what kind of goal can we shoot for? And so we see that milkweed is sort of naturally growing at this 1 to 5 stems per meter square. And obviously milkweed, reproduces by seed and by rhizome, so it's going to be naturally growing in the, increasing its population density over the years. But what else is interesting is that, again, back to this Thogmartin paper, using this data from Hartzler and Flockhart, they estimated this metric as well, the stem density within milkweed or within patches, as 1.95 stems per meter square. So how that compares to my roadsides is that we see this is the average stems per meter square, and that kind of fits right in that 95% confidence interval. So we see that 2 stems per meter square is pretty typical for milkweed within patches. Now, what we also did besides GPS each stem is I actually looked at every stem for eggs and larvae. But we ended up seeing that out of all of those stems, on average, only 10.1% of those stems are actually being utilized for oviposition by monarchs. This is really interesting because we had such a variety of stem densities overall that regardless of that, they're generally using 10% of those stems. So I think that's really informative to help us see, as we're establishing habitat, how much of those stems we can actually expect the monarch to be using. So the second part of my question that I wanted to focus on was, a lot of my research focuses on defining what a patch is, which I won't talk a lot about today, but I wanted to use this data to look at what monarch production potential would look like if all counties in Iowa adapted similar roadside management strategies. So this is a map of Iowa that shows in this green color all of the gravel roadside that is outside of city townships and forested areas. Excuse me. That means that there's over 59,000 miles of gravel roadside in Iowa. So if that's the case, I wanted to ask, so if I have the average of 3,554 stems per mile on all those roadsides, Iowa could produce 209 million stems. And this is actually really close to the goal for Iowa that's been sort of portioned for Iowa to produce to meet our conservation goals. And if this 209 million stems, of those, if 10% of them are being utilized by butterflies, and there's about a 2% survival rate, which has been documented in this paper that I've cited here, that would mean that in a given generation, gravel roadsides could produce 420 or 1,000 monarch butterflies. So then the question to ask, I think, is how are these gravel roadsides being maintained, and what is the reality? What do all the counties in Iowa actually look like? So I contacted our Story County weed manager and asked him about the methods for establishing milkweed in these roadsides. And he said that all they've done is they've stopped spraying for milkweed 30 years ago with boom spraying. And all Asclepias syriaca has been naturally establishing in the habitat. And I think this is really good news because this is relatively low maintenance. Granted, it can't speak to anything that the farmers themselves are doing out on the landscapes. So, also just wanted to say that we know that there are several counties in Iowa that have been eliminating milkweed from their habitats. And so it would be helpful to use some of the software technology like Anuj was talking about to get an estimate for how much milkweed is actually out there in these counties and if the density that I saw is really typical. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Iris.
Great, thank you for that summary, Teresa. So thanks again to all the presenters. We have some time here at the end for some questions. So if you have any questions specific to one of the presentations or generally for all of our presenters, please go ahead and put those into the chat box. We've had several questions come in so far, so I will run through those. We have a couple specific questions. Allison, first I'll start with you. Can you speak to whether or not your assessment will also include suitability of roadside habitat for other pollinator species? And Allison, you might be on mute if you're speaking right now.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the question. Our project is specifically for monarchs. What monarchs are using is similar to what other pollinators use. So the nectar plant component would be the most useful for thinking about other pollinators. The other components that bees might need are nesting sites, and that is not part of our profile. That could be easily added to, like if you're imagining an app, it would just be another category. And for nesting bees, you know, there are things you look for like open, undisturbed, sandy soil, bunch grasses, woody stems that they could nest in, or other woody components of vegetation. So that could be an added component. I have done some thinking about the pollinator habitat profiling overall, and those are some ways in which they differ.
Okay, great, thank you. This question was posed to Kristen, so maybe we'll start with you, Kristen, but I think it'd be helpful to hear from the other presenters as well. Kristen, can you speak to the width of the mowing strip on roadsides and whether or not you think there's a possibility that that width could be lessened and made more narrow to provide more habitat? Kristen, you may also be on mute if you're speaking.
Okay, I'm here. So I think it's usually about 9 meters, you know, but the width is going to vary a lot depending on the roadside. There might be a little bit of flexibility, but I think for the most part, you know, that's a really important area for safety considerations. So we've mainly been focusing on thinking about areas outside of that safety zone. But again, I guess depending on the particular road, there may be some flexibility, but again, you know, making sure that that clear and safety zone is well managed for the you know, safety considerations that are important as well. So that would be maybe in some areas.
Okay. Any of the other presenters, is that something that you've looked at in terms of the width of the mowing strip, particularly for safety right alongside the pavement?
Yeah, I looked at that last year in the sites that we profiled, and we had a much narrower mowing width. That was the clear zone for us, was more about like 3 meters wide. And then in our survey, we did ask what the frequency was that different departments of transportation were mowing full width. And that varied all over the maps, from some people mowing several times a year, they would mow the full width of the right-of-way, whereas others would only mow that full width every other year or as needed. So, and the responses were all like even across different frequencies. So I do think there's a lot of variability there. My thinking is that here it is that they do one pass with their mower, so it's the width of their mower that is that clear zone. So I don't know, maybe in other places they make more than one pass. So it sounds like that varies a little bit.
Thank you. How about in any of the work you've done, have you looked at the utilization of rest areas for areas where monarch habitat or pollinator habitat could be provided?
This is Allison. I haven't looked at that at all, though it sounds really promising.
This is Kristen, and there have been monarch way stations added to some of our rest areas, including, you know, kind of educational signage, and then also we had a couple closed rest areas where some habitat was added. So definitely potential.
And also potentially an opportunity, you know, for public outreach, certainly as well. I think at the rest area spots. On that point, and thinking about engagement with citizen scientists, this question was directed to Anuj, but I wonder if others could also speak to any work that you've done with citizen science. But Anuj, I'm starting with you. Has there been any discussion or interest in potentially equipping citizen science volunteers' cars with cameras like what you've been studying to provide additional data collection?
I think that would be a very good idea for doing that. We have been thinking about first including it, if possible, to the existing DOT vendors vehicles, which as such go out and collect the data on pavement conditions. But obviously the algorithm would also work with citizen scientists, and the good news is that you don't need very expensive cameras or anything like that. You can potentially get by with depending on your speed, you can get by with just normal action cams which come out there. So if you get a picture and you can visually see that milkweed, chances are the algorithm would also detect it.
Great, thanks. How about other work with citizen scientists?
Are you asking if citizen scientists could participate in helping evaluate roadside areas as habitat? If that's the question, I would say there could be a role for that if they wanted to work with the DOTs to have. I feel like the relationship with the DOT would be important because there are always the permitting and safety considerations when you're, working many sites up and down the roadways. But there is another effort, the Integrated Monarch Monitoring Program, that does have citizen scientists conducting the monarch habitat profiles in a variety of different land use types. And so there are going to be some of those habitat sites established in roadway rights of way, and those are going to just be a little bit less. There won't be as many of those, and they would that data will roll up into the national data set, where we start getting a comparison of the monarch habitat and use across the different land use sectors and across the broad geographies of the entire U.S. And so anyone interested in participating in that program can contact me too.
Okay, great, thanks, Allison. Tyler, I know that you responded in the chat box to this question, but do you want to expand a bit on the question regarding the study of other pesticides and interactions among pesticides, and how that may play into the work that you're doing with your model?
Sure. I mean, the short answer is, all we need is more time. If we had all the time in the world, we could do it all. But we're looking at some different options. We've considered fall armyworms, but those are sprayed at a different time. You have demographic issues because you have different generations of monarchs. So, that's the short answer. Were there any pesticides you had in mind or particular interactions? Maybe I can, or feel free to email me if you had, some particular questions, and I can also ask I'm not the pesticide expert, but they've got 6 pesticides they're working with, and then we haven't decided on our full set for the full paper. So yeah, if you have more questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. We can do any of it. It just takes time and money,
Great, thanks, Tyler. Could you also, any of you really speak to the concern about traffic mortality in monarch habitat? Anyone want to take that one?
Well,
I'll just say a brief comment that, I think that there's a lot more work to be done to sort of understand how monarchs, what height they're flying next to our roadways. So there has been some studies showing smaller butterflies flying a little bit lower and being a little more at risk for mortality along roads. Also, there's been some different things about the frequency that butterflies are flying into the road from the roadside habitat, and if and depending on the quality of that habitat. And then we also know that the roadside habitats have a lot of value for producing young. And so I still yet have to kind of put together all these pieces of the puzzle. That's all that I was going to say. Go ahead, Kristen.
Well, I was going to respond, I guess, in a similar way, saying I think, it's an area where we definitely need more information to, evaluate production, how many are being added to the population versus how many are being removed. And I think we're starting to get some good information, but yeah, certainly there's a lot more we can do. And I think a lot more fascinating questions about, different ways to think about managing roadsides to provide habitat, for other pollinators as well. So I think lots of interesting questions that still remain to be answered.
Great. Let's just do one last question. And this, I see, Teresa, it looks like you responded to this one also in comments, but maybe we could talk a little bit more about the kind of history of vegetation management on the roadsides. In your city, Teresa, it sounded like you were looking mostly at sites and roadsides that had been long established with their vegetation management practices. But any thoughts on opportunities for habitat along reconstructed or expanded areas where basically, the habitat can essentially be, created or restored in a shorter time frame?
Yeah, so as far as the roadsides I monitored are concerned, it'll vary by county because every county can decide, at least on the county road level, can decide how they want to do it. So for Story County, so my roadsides, yes, have been established for a long time. But according to our weed manager, when they establish, if they have to, dig up the roadside for some reason and establish new habitat, concerning milkweed, they don't include common milkweed in the mix anymore. And they include other milkweed species. So what that means essentially is that for any new habitat in Story County, any common milkweed that is growing has been naturally establishing there. So for us in Story County, we have lots of gravel roads with lots of milkweed. So all of that milkweed essentially has just established on its own. So I think that we can expect that sort of behavior to happen in all the counties that follow those similar management practices. I think that it is typical that if you're establishing new habitat, especially if your seed mix is appropriate, that common milkweed will be really abundant in the first few years. I can't speak to how that changes over the years because I think we need more research on that. But I think what we've seen is that because milkweed likes to grow in areas that doesn't have a lot of competition, as you think about like a gravel roadside, milkweed really likes to come up right on the edge of that gravel because there's not a lot else going on there. They like that really great, that sun to soil contact. In new established areas, I think you can expect to see lots and lots of milkweed. So, but it's interesting that what we're finding is a lot higher than what's been previously estimated. So either milkweed is growing more abundantly now, and it's just the natural increase of the population that we're sort of speaking to, or maybe we've underestimated the amount of milkweed that's actually out in the landscape. So I think it's back to the question. I just think it's likely that milkweed can easily be established in roadside habitats. It seems like common milkweed, that's where it's thriving.
Great. Okay. Well, I want to thank all of our speakers again for sharing your research updates. Encourage you all to follow up with them directly if you have questions following their presentations. We will also post a recording of this webinar on the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group website. So you should be able to find that within the next week or so. And we'll also be following up with a survey that you'll receive in your email inbox. So appreciate any feedback you can provide there as well in terms of other topics you'd like to see us cover by webinar. Encourage you also to look into the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group meeting and potentially participating remotely next week. And we will continue to send out updates as we have them. So thank you again.